Good afternoon, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you at the ACER-CEER webinar presenting the results of the Energy Retail and Consumer Protection volume of the 2021 ACER-CEER Market Monitoring Report. My name is Jana Házová. I am co-chairing CER Customers and Retail Markets Working Group and ACER Retail Working Group, and it's my pleasure to be here today with you and to be the moderator of today's webinar. First of all, let me provide you with several technical details. If I may ask to proceed to the next slide. Yes, thank you very much. This meeting will be recorded. We would also like to let you know that you as participants will be muted except for the speakers. We would also like to encourage you to pass questions to us. Please note that there will be a Q&A chat in there and you are welcome to put your questions in there. And we will have a session in today's webinar where your questions will be responded. Please include your name and affiliation when you're raising your question. Thank you. And our aim of today's webinar is to share with you key findings and conclusions, and especially also recommendations of the retail and consumer protection volume according to the following agenda. The introductory remarks will be introduced by Mr. Pedro Valderho. Pedro is Vice President of CER. He is also ACER-CEER Guest Working Group Chair and member of the ACER Board of Regulators. Then after, you will get the information on key findings and recommendations from Natalie McCoy and Seamus Byrne. Natalie is co-chairing CER, CRM Working Group and ACER Retail Working Group, and Seamus is co-convener of the Market Monitoring Task Force. Next part of the webinar will be dedicated to Mr. Philip Louis' presentation. Philip is the founder, CEO and founder of VASA ETT and will provide you with recent retail market developments. Next part is dedicated to the European Commission reaction. This part will be presented to you by Ms. Adela Tesařová from DG ENER. Adela is Head of Unit for Consumers, Local Initiatives and Just Transition at DG ENER. Then after, we will enter into the session for Q&As and the discussion. And as I've informed you previously, we encourage you to post questions to the dedicated Q&A chat. Hereafter, Ms. Sheila Bartok, who is team leader for gas markets and energy retail infrastructure, gas and retail within ACER, will conclude with closing remarks from her side. And now, not to take so long, I will pass the word to Mr. Pedro Verdelho, as I've told you, Vice President of CEER, ACER and CEER Gas Working Group Chair and member of the ACER Board of Regulators, who will present the introductory remarks to you. Pedro, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jana. I'm very happy to be here. And well, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you enjoy this webinar. And on behalf of ACER and CEER, I am very pleased to welcome you to today's webinar to launch a very important and timely report, which reviews the performance of Europe's energy markets for consumers. I see that we already have a full room, virtual one, with more than 100 participants. We expect more to join. We have 280 people registered. And well, to kick off today's event, I would like to share some introductory words on this in-depth monitoring activity developed by ACER and CEER since many years. And well, we are all very aware of the ongoing energy crisis and of the profound changes and impacts that this is having on consumers, on and also on our economies, not only in our professional life as regulators, policymakers, companies, and other relevant stakeholders who have to adjust and rethink their priorities and find quick solutions for the challenges we are all facing. But also, and most important, to consumers who suffer directly the impacts of these high energy prices and the volatility we are noticing. This is really quite challenge to all of us. This wave of unprecedented events is affecting the markets and ultimately consumers, especially the vulnerable ones, who should be protected from volatility, uncertainty, and risks to their security of supply. More than ever, the analysis undertaken by ACER and CEER in its market monitoring reports assumes greater importance. This is the perfect tool to provide us with a clear picture of what is happening in the markets. And at the same time, this monitoring work is also helpful in the course of our duties, helping us understand how things are evolving and to better consider what we can do to minimize the negative impacts of this situation. As you may recall, at the end of last year, we noticed an increase in energy prices with the start of the economic recovery after the pandemic. Back then, at these times, so last year, end of last year, we thought the situation would be extraordinary without a continuous effect on the markets. On spring, we foreseen that the situation would be overcome. However, 1 year later, we can certainly realize that this extraordinary situation has intensified in the course of 2022, in particular following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Therefore, this year's edition of the MMR has been tailored to examine these impacts, and so the report covers 2021 as business as usual, but also includes information on 2022, especially as regards prices. Considering the rapid evolution of things, we considered it relevant to include data from a broader period to help us acknowledge the evolution and potential tendencies that are emerging over this period. This edition of the MMR gives us some insights on retail market performance, supplier concentration levels, and the availability of gas and electricity offers to consumers. Also, the price paid by energy consumers for both gas and electricity across the European Union is analyzed. And the impact of high energy prices on household expenditure is also taken into account in the report. For all of us, understanding what has been happening across Europe is essential, particularly now as policymakers develop, discuss, and approve emergency measures to deal with the impacts of this crisis. In this regard, I am pleased that our friends at ACER-CEER are with us today, given their constant work on energy markets. The information that they are being analyzing is very important for us. And of course, we welcome the chance to hear the thoughts of the European Commission, who is working intensively to develop legal solutions to help us mitigate the effects of the present situation. As regulators, we stress the importance of targeting measures and support where they are most needed. We also fully support the European Commission's determination to intensify the path towards decarbonization to help us overcome this crisis and to keep incentives for energy efficiency alongside consumer protection efforts. We must also be careful to distinguish between short-term interventions that are being handled through these recent emergency regulations and long-term goals for our energy sector and the economy overall. A selection of short-term measures that might contribute also to our long-term goals should be prioritized. We hope that the extensive monitoring presented in this year's report can contribute to these efforts. The MMER report was published last Friday, and of course I expect you may not yet have had a chance to read through all the rich details, but as ACER and CR, we hope you will find information and analysis of great interest. And now I wish you all a pleasant event. And Jana, please, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pedro, for your opening remarks and opening this webinar. Now, let me please proceed with the next item, which is the main part, the report conclusions and recommendations. Those will be presented to you by Ms. Natalie McCoy and Mr. Seamus Byrne. First, Natalie, the floor is yours for report conclusions.
Thanks, Jana. There's actually so much information, as Pedro was saying just a moment ago. The report is very rich in details, and there's a wealth of information, analysis, data that's, I think, very useful and very interesting. And it is a long document, it's 97 pages, so you may want to dip in and out according to the topics that you're looking for. But certainly, I think it's a good reference document, and it's very useful for any work and analysis that you may have coming on various aspects that are covered in the paper. I think if we try to, exactly, thank you very much. If we try to analyze one or another aspect of the market, we don't get a really detailed and a full understanding of what's happening. So it's important, as we always say, to look at several issues together, and then that helps you to really get a picture of how markets are performing. And that's what we try to do in the market monitoring report, by covering a lot of different angles of retail markets and of consumer protection. And today I just want to share a few of the conclusions that you can find in the paper, and give you some examples of the figures that we include there. And I think they help to illustrate the kind of analysis that we've done in this year's market monitoring. As Pedro was saying, it's been an extraordinary year, 2021 and now 2022, and it's just the beginning, if you will. But still, we've identified some trends and some conclusions of what we saw happening in the last year and a half or so. Of course, the extraordinary situation and the increase in prices has had an impact on consumers, but also on the market itself and on the suppliers. We've seen an increase in supplier bankruptcy and also the exit of different suppliers from the market. So this has made it difficult, both for the consumers, but in particular, the changes in the market and the demands on them in terms of prices and wholesale market arrangements, their guarantees and the hedging requirements, and some of these issues made it harder for suppliers to meet their obligations, which led to a decrease in the kinds of offers that were available to consumers, and also an increase in concentration levels, as we saw some of the smaller and newer market participants leaving the retail market. We also, trying to understand what was happening on the market, we found that not all regulators monitor the uptake of the offers that are being chosen by consumers in the market. So it's hard to understand exactly which kinds of contracts consumers are actually choosing. For those NRAs that do have that information, we find that a majority of consumers, I should say, a majority of consumers have fixed price contracts, which is not a big surprise. But as such contracts were able to, if you will, to cushion for a while the increase on the wholesale market, as these suppliers have to renew their wholesale contracts and procure new energy at higher prices, we can expect, and this is something we see throughout the report, that there will be price increases very, very soon, or if not already happening, for most consumers. And so that will be continuing. We predict, I think it's not a big surprise, into the coming year and next year. Also, if we go down to the next slide, We can see visually what this has been happening and what this means for consumers, the actual household prices. You can see the increasing tendency over the last few years, especially 21, a sharp increase, which initially we thought was just because it was post-pandemic, economic recovery, but then has worsened following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So for electricity, this has meant 7.5% increase for households, 90% increase for industry. And as opposed to previous years when usually prices were driven by taxes or support to renewables, really the major driver of the increase in prices has been the energy component of the bill. And you can see on the next slide, similar trend for gas and a much steeper increase for industry gas prices, an increase of 95%. So it's quite dramatic for our businesses. If I could just go to the next slide. Can also share with you what that means in terms of how much of energy is how much we spend on energy in terms of our household expenditure. And as you can see, in most countries, the dark blue line shows that it's increased for many of us, or the dark orange line for in the case of gas. So the price increases and also socioeconomic conditions, inflation, other problems that we're facing in our national economies mean that as a proportion of our household expenditure, energy is increasing ever more so. And the expectation is that it will continue, especially now in the winter months. Against this backdrop, it's also interesting to note that, in fact, 8 member states have actually a formal definition of energy poverty, which is also important in terms of identifying which consumers to target in terms of support measures and other kinds of actions that you can take to help them face these prices. So next slide, please. Part of being able to support consumers and find various solutions, including energy efficiency and savings, and giving them signals about when to consume their energy, is having information about real-time information about consumption. And smart meters are an important tool to be able to do that. We've been gathering data on smart meter rollout for many years now, and you can see here, so far the average penetration across the EU is 54%. Some countries are a bit further along in that process, and nearly 100% are upper 90s. You can see in the shades of the rainbow here, but in many cases, not all consumers and not all countries have access to this kind of real-time information and smart meter services, if you will, which I think is important to keep in mind at the current time. We're trying to really to promote energy efficiency and savings measures. On the next slide, please. We can also see that governments have really made a tremendous effort to respond to the crisis and to provide support mechanisms to consumers. There's a whole variety. We've identified here a group of 7, trying to understand what's being applied in different countries. And these were rolled out very quickly when we started to see the crisis and the sharp increase at the end of 21 and now going through 2022. And you can see there's a variety. A lot of them have to do with tax measures or direct assistance to consumers. And most countries have applied these type of measures. Some others have different tools, so deferring bills, extended regulated prices, or even state aid or other measures for business customers. So this is, if you will, quite a range of support schemes that are being applied. They're not necessarily targeted at the most vulnerable or the consumers with the most need. So that is one of the conclusions also you'll find in the market monitoring report, to try to find solutions that really support the most vulnerable consumers who will be disproportionately impacted now by the situation, by the ongoing crisis. I think I have one more slide. That was really the highlight. So any questions? Thank you very much. At the end, I think we have a Q&A with Jana, but I hope you find that very interesting. And as I say, the report has a lot more information and insights on what's been happening in the last year. Thank you.
Thanks, Natalie. So I can take over then. So my name is Seamus Byrne. I'm policy officer within ACER's Infrastructure, Gas and Retail department. I'm going to take you through some of the key recommendations. So in total, we have 9 recommendations, but I've focused this down onto 5. And if I have time at the end, I will touch upon some of the remaining ones. So I'll take you through the top left of the energy light bulb, or of the light bulb here, and I'll work around in a clockwise way here. So kind of one of the first recommendations we have here is about assisting consumers. And look, we're quite cognizant that consumers are facing significant price increases, like particularly facing this winter. While consumers were somewhat shielded, while there was price increases, they were shielded from the initial wholesale price increases last year, mainly because, as Natalie mentioned, like a lot of them in the member states where we do where monitoring of energy contracts is in place, the majority of them were on fixed price contracts, which did give them a little bit of a shield. However, these contracts will be coming to an end, and energy suppliers are now facing significant difficulties in offering similar type of fixed price contracts, as it's becoming quite difficult for them to actually offer the product to consumers, and as such, consumers will face a significant increase. So what we're focusing on here is that the NRAs, and this will be in conjunction with the suppliers, is how they assist consumers in actually managing these price increases going forward. We're kind of thinking that a proactive approach might be a little bit more beneficial to the consumers instead of a reactive. So some NRAs and suppliers could consider maybe requiring or suggesting that consumers enter into kind of a monthly payment plan in advance of the winter period when the bills will be higher. So they kind of build up a little bit of a credit for themselves, so that those bills, the higher bills in January and February, which are normally a bit higher, will be a little bit softened via this measure. Moving on to support measures. Look, Philip will touch upon the kind of impacts that are currently happening in the retail markets at the moment, but as I mentioned, it's quite clear that the consumer should expect significant cost increases in their bills, particularly this winter and more than likely into 2023. We've seen that energy consumers have been provided some assistance in all member states, and they should member states should really be commended here because they did act quite quickly. What we're saying is that these measures should be very targeted, though, and really aimed at those consumers who really, really need the assistance. Such measures such as kind of energy coupons for all consumers may not be targeted and may give a benefit to some consumers who may not need some assistance. So to focus in on who to assist, you could look at kind of household expenditure. These are kind of things you'll see Philip will touch upon, and Natalie actually mentioned it there as well. And those consumers who are spending a larger proportion of their household income on their energy should really be the core focus here. Onto comparison tools. So you will see there's kind of a mix in the recommendations we have in this year's MMR. So some of it is in response to the energy crisis, whereas others are kind of focusing in on the kind of requirements that are outlined in the electricity directive, and there's 2 here. So one is comparison tools, and for those who may not be aware, like a comparison tool is basically they're just websites that allow consumers to easily check what offers are available in their markets, and they might be paying more than what they're actually paying, and there might be better options available to them. What we're asking NRAs here and suggesting that they do is they actually look at the publicly operated comparison tool websites in their member states and just ensure that they're fully compliant with the requirements as set out in the electricity directive. In the report also we include a case study. This is from the Swedish NRA, and this looks at their own independent and publicly operated tool and the measures they have taken since 2015 when it was first initiated, and the measures I regard to advertisement and actually engaging the consumer and increasing utilization of it. And what we're asking as well is that NRAs and the independent tools are actually advertised, and their usage is and your utilization is monitored. They've kind of targets to actually increase. And if you're monitoring who is using it, what we're of the view is that if you know who's using it, you know who's not using it. So if you know who's not using it, then you can actually start targeting those specific cohort of consumers to maybe increase engagement among those individuals. Onto information campaigns. So I think it's quite clear that we do have a limited number of levers that are kind of left to us. We're not going to be able to increase the supply side this winter or within a short period of time. So we're seeing quite a lot of calls actually to reduce demand, and it's one of the key options that will be available to policymakers. It's a little bit easier for maybe some of the larger consumers, maybe at present, some of the domestic consumers may not see this. However, we've seen kind of the benefits of large information campaigns through COVID and that they can play a role. So what we're saying here is that, NRAs and the member states should consider how to regularly inform the energy consumers, be they large, be they small, of when may be the best time to consume energy. And the aim here would be to actually lower the demand curves. And this would actually bring about a benefit for all consumers overall. There are examples of this in place. So right now, I think if you look at towards France, there's information campaigns that are utilized within weather reports. And recently we would have seen text messaging alerts in California, which reduced electricity demand. So basically the system operator sent out an alert to all consumers via their mobile phones and just kind of informed them that they need to reduce, and they got a very quick response from consumers that way. The final point that I'll touch upon, and then I'll very briefly just mention the last few, is energy bills. Again, this is linking back to the electricity directive and the requirements that are set out in it. What we see when we look at the energy bills that are being issued to consumers across the member states is that in the majority, they're not compliant with what is outlined in the directive. I think we have one member state that actually is compliant. So again, what we're asking NRAs is to actually go back and look at these bills that are being issued to consumers to ensure that they're fully compliant. Not only must they be compliant, but we're also going a little step further and making sure that they're kind of easy to read, because there's a lot of information that is required to be included within the consumer bills. Right now, when we dig into some member states, we can see that there is vital information missing. So consumers don't know how much they actually consumed in the last billing period. They don't know when their contract is finishing. They don't know how to compare alternative options within their markets. They don't know how much they consume in comparison to average consumption in a market. And I will be very brief. I'll make some three final points at the bottom of the bulb. So categorization of complaints, what we're touching upon here is what we see is the way resolution bodies are monitoring and organizing complaints. It makes it difficult for us to actually identify where the majority of the complaints are. So what we're asking is that they actually categorize their complaints separately between suppliers, distribution system operators, and the types of complaints that they have. So we can identify then, well, where the key issues are going. Is it a supplier issue? Is it a distribution system operator issue? And then you can actually make recommendations beyond that. Review the SOLR mechanism. So SOLR is the supplier of last resort. What we're touching upon here is just for NRAs to check how effective these mechanisms are. We did see that they did work last year and they were utilized quite a lot in some member states. So we're just saying just to check in case there are issues coming down the line again. And then, as mentioned by Natalie, there is the monitoring of contracts. So we have a limited number of member states that actually monitor what the uptake of contracts is in their different markets. We don't know what is the proportion of contract breakdown within a market at a given time. It's kind of difficult to understand what difficulties will be faced in the coming year. So that was the last point we're touching on. Natalie or Jana, I can hand back to you now. That's all from my side.
Thank you very much, Seamus, and also thanks very much, Natalie, for your contribution on key findings. As you can see, there are 5 key recommendations, but as we have heard from Seamus, there are still other items that can be done better for the future. It's also something that we would like to raise your attention to and encourage you to ask questions or your considerations about those recommendations in the chat. The chat is the Q&A chat, just for technical information. And going back to our agenda, I would like to mention that and it was raised already by previous speakers, that given the significance of the current energy crisis in Europe, this year's volume also includes some recent pricing information. That means for 2022, which has been prepared by Vasa ETT. And at this stage, let me please pass directly to Mr. Philip Lewis, who is the CEO and founder of Vasa ETT. And he will present you the recent retail market developments. Philip, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jana. Thanks a lot. And so, hello, it's a real honor to talk to you all today and give a very, very brief overview of recent developments in European retail energy markets. Just to touch on some of the findings and recommendations already excellently summarized by Natalie and Seamus. Try not to overlap too much. So now I've been analyzing the European retail energy markets since they opened originally 25 years ago, over 25 years ago. And in my view, the markets have changed as much in the past 6 months as in the last, well, actually quarter of a century. Prices, choice, supply landscape, to name but a few aspects, have all massively, massively changed. But while many of the changes have been very tough for consumers and worrying for the future of the market, I believe there's also potentially a lot of good that will come or could come and is in a way coming, especially if we play our regulatory cards optimally. So regarding prices, as you see here, we've got some price data here. There's a lot more in the report, but regarding prices, if we assume pre-COVID as business as usual, I guess you could call it, then COVID saw a temporary dip in retail prices, resulting mainly from falling wholesale prices and some tax or VAT reductions. Since the onset of the energy crisis, though, despite a raft of support measures from governments, all-in prices, energy bills have increased by 85%, according to our research, for electricity, and 160% for gas, and that's compared to pre-COVID levels. So this is historically, not just in the period that we're showing here, but it's historically unprecedented. Really, really massive price increases. If you look historically going way back, since we've been looking at prices since competition began, prices generally have been remarkably stable over those years. Next slide. So the Europe-wide trend naturally hides substantial variation in price levels between the states. Not all states have suffered so badly. Some have suffered even worse. The level of suffering, in fact, seems to depend on so many factors. We've identified more than a dozen categories of factors, including market characteristics such as wholesale behavior, energy procurement, hedging and pricing strategies of suppliers, tariff and component mixed differences between markets, also cross-subsidization and so on. But it also depends heavily on the level of price regulation and protection measures, as was referred to by Seamus there, but also, as we'll mention in a moment, a little bit more. And it also depends on the disposable income of people in those states. Now, if you go to the next slide, then we look a little bit at that disposable income or rather the electricity and gas as a share of disposable income. And I'd say, first of all, that as a disclaimer, the available disposable income data used here is the latest available data, not totally up to date, but it's the latest available data. It will be slightly different. In fact, the situation will probably look a little bit worse even with the current situation. But in any case, and it's also not possible to simply merge electricity and gas. Of course, you don't know which customers have both electricity and gas, so you can't simply add share of disposable income for electricity and gas together in that way. But nevertheless, when you look at typical energy bills across Europe, with electricity at around about 4 to 5% for a typical bill, for an average amongst those markets, and gas at around 8%, it's clear that a large proportion of customers in Europe are now in or approaching some form of energy poverty. And in fact, when you actually think that this is for a typical customer, or typical consumption level, It's actually very significant. So in some markets, in fact, the situation is way more extreme. As you see there, some it's not quite as bad, but on average, that is a very extreme situation. And to reiterate, these figures include support measures. The situation would be way worse without those support measures, as I'll mention in a moment. So next slide. But now, in the current situation, there's been a massive change that will be obvious to anyone who has been looking around for better offers. I'm sure many of you yourselves have. And there are very few offers out there. There are, in fact, fewer suppliers taking on customers, and the suppliers which are offering tariffs are offering fewer contracts. Fixed price contracts, formerly the norm in these markets, as Natalie mentioned earlier on, have in fact all but disappeared from many markets, are even non-existent in some markets, or are horribly expensive in other markets or in the same markets. Some suppliers have even taken on or are taking on now only hourly based contracts. And so the market is changing massively. So you would think that given that savings potentials have disappeared in the market, but actually not really. That's not actually the case. So these figures which we're showing here, which I should add, can change dramatically from month to month. So we have to always be careful, because we'll show a graph 1 month and then someone will say, okay, it's not like that right now, or this is how fast the market is moving. If data is 2 weeks out of date, it looks wrong. It's moving that fast. So I'd say that these figures here show a very different picture. Savings potentials have actually increased during the crisis in many markets. The challenge, though, which customers face is understanding the risks of the options they face. So which cheaper offers, or will cheaper offers stay cheaper? Or is it better to take an expensive long-term fixed price? Is the price cap really a safe price cap, or is it likely to increase later on? Will the supplier they're looking at stay in business even, or will they be left out in the cold? Can I really benefit from the market-based hourly contracts, or is it just too much of a risk? So customers have choices. There are significant big savings to be made, but these are difficult choices for customers, and customers need good independent advice that they can trust, or they may either miss the opportunities or move to an even worse deal than they're on at the moment. So the next slide. So in support of customers, active and inactive customers, governments have implemented a raft of temporary measures, as mentioned earlier by Seamus and Natalie. And those measures include tax and VAT reduction, subsidies or compensation and price caps and so on. These figures are a couple of months out of date, and we are updating that data now, and more measures have been taken since we did this analysis. But at least as of July this year, according to our calculations, energy bills across the 19 electricity and 14 gas markets with measures that we analyzed, those prices in those markets have been reduced by 21 to 22%, depending on gas or electricity, as a result of those measures. So this is not an insignificant amount. For the customers who need such reductions the most, this is incredibly good news. The three questions which stand out, however, in my mind are, well, as mentioned earlier, do all customers really need these reductions? How much consumption reduction will be lost through these measures? Is there an energy security trade-off that we're facing because of this? And what happens when the measures end? What will happen to prices then? These are very important issues that we sort of have to understand, that we've seen some markets that have removed measures and prices have severely shot up afterwards, and that kind of bill shock could be very severe for customers. So next slide. And so last slide. So the energy crisis has had so many negative impacts on retail energy markets in Europe: high prices, price re-regulation, less choice of contracts, liquidity issues, suppliers going out of business, as already mentioned, and not only bad suppliers, I might add. Indeed, in many ways, the history of liberalization has all but reversed. If I look at it 25 years ago, we've gone an awful long way back to where we started. But to finish off, I would like to highlight one of the positive changes in the fundamentals of retail energy pricing that has resulted from the recent COVID and energy crises. In fact, for as long as I recall, regulators and media alike have called on energy suppliers to make prices more cost reflective. Well, aside from the issue of how reflective wholesale prices are of generation costs, analysis investigating the relationship and lag between wholesale and retail energy component prices seems to indicate that retail prices now respond to spot prices far more closely than previously. And indeed, in many markets, the correlation is extremely close, as we see here. The lag is very short, and the relationship is not only when the prices are going up, as some might expect. And the change is despite the national support measures that actually counteract that relationship, go against that relationship. So while this may not be a desirable current happening for consumers, of course, they don't want prices to react right now to those wholesale prices necessarily. Well, definitely. But in the long term, combined with an efficient wholesale market and improving customer price elasticity and of demand, this could signal, I believe, a positive trend in energy retail. So a lot of change. Very, very brief summary there of some of the happenings that we see in the market. There's a lot more to talk about and a lot more in the report. And thanks very much for your time.
I would like to thank you, Philip, for that overview. Of course, we are all facing that extreme situation on the energy market, and there is also a lot of work ahead of us. I was wondering, I haven't seen any question in our Q&A chat. I would very much like to see some of your reflections or your personal opinion, or if you would like to share your experience from your member state, or how do you see the situation also currently, because it's good to see that it's also in the context and therefore also the data for 2022 mentioning right now by addressing right now by Philip. So we would very much be in favor of getting your insight into this problemacy. So at this moment, it's my pleasure to welcome Ms. Adela Tesařová, who is Head of Unit for Consumers, Just Transition and Local Initiatives at DG Energy. Adela will provide us with European Commission reactions on the report and the situation as such. Adela, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ayana, and good afternoon, colleagues. Many thanks for this seminar and for the super timely report. You know, I'm a big fan of the market monitoring report, and so very happy to see the new edition. Of course, it comes at a very difficult moment for energy consumers and actually for the retail market as such, because of course the crisis is very much testing the retail market. I think we would have liked to have the retail market more developed maybe by the time the crisis came, also because the implementation of the Clean Energy for All Europeans package has been delayed. So I think our consumers were caught a bit unprepared. They would have been in a better situation if we had fully implemented the Clean Energy package. And that's also what the report shows, looking at the past data. But of course, we can see that we are kind of, the crisis really bringing us to a crossroads. Yeah, I think a lot what has been built over the 2-3 decades, it might disappear. Hopefully not everywhere, but we see that, you know, the choice of consumers is a very theoretical thing in many countries. And of course, we still have people on fixed price contracts, but they will soon face reality. We can see, you know, concentration of suppliers. Some of the novelty suppliers are disappearing for different reasons. So there is a lot going on in the market. And of course, as people's bills increase, policymakers are trying to find solutions, because of course one thing is to have a price signal for consumers, which is something probably was largely missing until very recently, where people were paying their invoices without even thinking about it, most of the people, not everyone. And this also meant that there was no incentive to reduce demand, there was no incentive to install solar panels, there was no incentive to insulate our houses. But of course, there is a limit what a normal family can pay. And some of the invoices that people are receiving or people hear about other people receiving is making people afraid and scared. So I think the challenge for the current period is to find the right balance between helping consumers navigate a crisis and ensuring that everyone has access to energy to cover their basic needs and to be able to function, because energy is an essential good. Electricity is an essential good, and we need to heat our homes. So we need the affordability is one angle, but the other side is also to keep the incentive for people while protecting them, keep the incentive for people to act. Because I think the crisis is also a moment of waking up and making people interested in energy and making people interested in alternative solutions and how can they become active on the energy market. So I think there is a lot of positive potentially which the crisis could bring. And as so I think the challenge is really to balance well consumer protection and affordability with making use of the crisis for activation and consumer empowerment. As you know, in our legislation, we cover both consumer rights, consumer protection, and empowerment. And the empowerment potentially is what the crisis could bring. And I hope that this would be something that we will see as a result of the crisis. We will see more empowered consumers. But I think it's not given, because the retail market can go either way. So I think we are at a crucial moment. And we will see what the future brings. And I think it's important for policymakers to find the right balance. And as you know, a lot of work is going on also at the European level to marry these two principles. And maybe last remark from my side, the regulation that the Energy Council has adopted at the end of September, which is emergency measures in electricity, and this regulation contains measures how to increase revenues for member states so that they can channel these revenues back to consumers. There is also a very strong principle of keeping the incentive to reduce demand. So I think in this sense, the proposal, the council regulation is quite groundbreaking, because it also codifies the objective to have demand flexibility in our system, which also have impacts on consumers, and codifies the need to keep an incentive to reduce demand. So I think this could be quite a useful, although it's an emergency proposal, I hope it could be a useful piece in our thinking on where to bring the retail markets for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adela, for your insight and your reaction to the report. Also, what I see as very important, what you have mentioned, is how to incentivize people to be active while protecting consumers. So there's really that the main task is to find the right balance, and you was also mentioning the demand flexibility. So I think that's also from the regulatory perspective a very important topic to be discussed and explored. So thank you very much for your input, and we do have currently a question in our Q&A session. So if I may start the next part of today's agenda, entering in a Q&A session. The first question was submitted by Tara Connolly, asking, do you have an understanding of the levels of energy poverty being experienced by households across Europe this year? You mentioned several definitions. Does this impact on your ability to compare the situation in different countries? So if I may pass to Seamus at that stage. Seamus, could you please address this question?
Thanks, Jana. Thanks, Tara. Yeah, so as we've outlined in the report, we have definitions from 8 member states, here. So does it impact? It makes it a little bit tricky, and the ability to define is within the member state. So as outlined in the directive, the member state has the power to define here. So you might have kind of a variation of definitions across the member states. However, if you were to assume it would be linked with a certain level of household expenditure, you could probably link back with these slides that Philip presented earlier on the electricity and gas disposable income expenditure. So you can see in gas, I think it was in Portugal, it's going up to kind of just under 8%. And this has been increasing in recent, this year in comparison to previous years. And then if you go to gas, we've seen significant increases in gas expenditure. Like I think it's up to somewhere in the region of 25% in Bulgaria, whereas kind of a lot of other member states are hovering around 12% of household income. A lot of member states are, where we have seen kind of a link to household expenditures in the region of 10%. So you'd already see that some are kind of going a little bit beyond that. But it is something we will kind of dig into next year is, well, what is your definition for this and can it be actually measured? Because if you have a kind of a loose definition, it's tricky to analyze. But for me, looking at it, I would like to see, is there a percentage of household income taken on board? Probably then as well, like what's the energy consumption? Because people who are normally in certain households, if they have a lower income, they might be consuming less, but they mightn't have a home that's energy efficient. So it kind of, you have those options to take those into account. So that's kind of what I will be digging into in next year's. I don't know, Philip, if you have anything to add on the share of disposable income.
Yeah, I totally concur with you on that. I think that it is challenging because, of course, the numbers that are available. Well, first of all, the definitions, of course, are varied and they're kind of in a way limiting. The other thing, of course, is that when we're looking at averages, of course, we have to remember that that's just an average. There are a lot of customers that have way bigger incomes than the typical consumption, and they don't necessarily have, way bigger consumption than the typical consumption, but they don't necessarily have bigger income than those. And I think two other metrics that can also be kind of interesting to just get a sense of the magnitude here. When you talk to a lot of suppliers, they're getting to a position where they're really worried now that a large proportion of their customers are likely to be unable to pay in the not too distant future. And the other metric that we're seeing is just when you ask customers, are they seriously worried about prices? For example, in Finland right now, 2 surveys that I've seen suggest that over half of the population are extremely worried about their bills at the moment. And these are not even sort of the typical consumer groups. You'd think these are like homeowners. These are very much the midstream customers. So I think, yes, we need more data to understand it. We need more consistency, I would say, in definition. But I think that the problem is definitely no less severe than the data indicates. That's what I would suggest. Yeah.
Thank you very much to you both, Seamus and Philip, for your insight into that problemacy, and of course, the issue of definitions and being energy poverty is for a longer debate. Definitely, we have the next question. The question is addressed by Minstead Maina. Do we see an evolution with the energy crisis, a potential impact of wholesale price volatility, for instance? Maybe that one could be addressed to Philip as well, if I can pass to you shortly.
Thanks. I just very quickly on that, I would just say that absolutely this is a very important issue, I think, because this is not just the volatility in wholesale is not just something that happened because of the crisis. It was increasing before the crisis. The nature of wholesale markets is that they've been getting more volatile for a significant period of time. And of course, volatility is priced into retail prices in the form of retail risk. And so therefore, the more volatility, the more risk, the higher the prices. And so I would say, yes, that it's a long-term trend that's been massively exacerbated by the recent events.
Thank you very much. We do have the next question addressed by Tequin Alan. Which lessons do you draw from the many bankruptcies of suppliers? Right, it was already mentioned, suppliers of last resort and so on. So maybe at that stage, I would like to pass to my colleague Natalie. Natalie, can I pass that one question to you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a very good question, Ella. In fact, there are probably several things that you can not deduct, but that you can consider in terms of what these bankruptcies, the source of them is probably multiple. In some cases, it can be the business strategies of some of the newer suppliers, smaller suppliers who maybe didn't have very long-term hedging positions in terms of procuring their energy in advance so they could lock in a certain price and they could guarantee consumers and themselves the cost of that energy. In other cases, it can be the fact that you have very high liquidity guarantees, wholesale market requirements that mean that you have to have a very high working capital in order to do business in the wholesale market as a supplier. And as prices go up, the cost of those guarantees go up as well. And if you don't have, shall we say, the cash flow to take that on, you find yourself not able to fulfill your requirements. So there are different reasons, maybe. Many of them come back to the cash flow and the capital available to these suppliers, and whether the requirements, for example, for suppliers to enter into the retail market and to really provide services to consumers, whether those requirements to do business were robust enough to help them manage the risk and not transfer all of the risk to consumers, which is what happens when they go fully bankrupt, or whether you could also argue whether the actual market rules, in particular the financial requirements, the guarantees, and the different liquidity issues, whether those are too demanding for the energy sector, because in fact they're designed for all economic sectors. It's actually financial regulation, it's not energy regulation. So there are several lessons and conclusions you can start to draw from that, from the different situations and causes, which make you wonder whether maybe there are some improvements in the rules that could be considered, whether in the financial requirements or also in the trading and operating licensing requirements for suppliers themselves. So I'm not sure if that helps, but that would be my first thought. I don't know, Seamus, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I'll be quite brief. It's kind of something we touched upon in the ACER April assessment there published last April. You know, so what we saw in a lot of cases were, yeah, there were a lot of suppliers that were acting in a responsible manner. Like you know, we can see this in the prices from last year. It actually shielded a lot of consumers. So they had, as you touched upon, they had actually protected their position. They'd offered a product to consumers at a certain price and they were able to back it up. However, it was clear that there were a lot of suppliers that were offering a product at a price which they had not covered themselves or covered their position, and they very much found themselves in difficulty very, very quickly. As you mentioned, there were maybe some markets where it's potentially a little bit too easy to enter. So maybe a little bit of some tightening there might be required. You know, maybe there's an enhanced role for the NRAs with regard to the issuing of licenses and maybe the member state. We did see in some that there was no licensing arrangements at all. And then on the bankruptcies, kind of looking at the impacts of it, you know, well, we've touched upon this, like how did the supplier of last resort mechanism go? I think it was really, really tested this year and late last year to the extent that it has never been tested before. And there are impacts there as well to consumers. Like generally consumers are placed on a higher price, immediately because the supplier taking on those cohort consumers can't offer the same price that was being previously offered. And this comes as a difficulty to the consumers as well. So yeah, like there's definitely quite a few lessons to be learned there and actually improvements to be made. Philip, you might have something from your side as well.
Yeah, just very, very quick. I agree with what you said. I think that it's a tight balance to get right, because on the one hand, we need to make sure that the licenses check whether they're financially viable, these companies, and capable of operating without then having a whole raft of stuff that actually just makes life really difficult, of course, for those players as well. So it's but I would agree. I think there were a lot of players in the market that shouldn't have been there, but unfortunately, a lot of babies went out with the bathwater as well, I think, in this case.
Thank you very much, dear colleagues, for responding to this question. Given the timing, I would try to be short for that those three other questions. The first one maybe could be addressed directly to Natalie in order to get all the necessary information on the electricity bill, how challenging it is, and how that can be addressed.
Yeah, I think this is the million-dollar question that very few suppliers have managed to crack. And I probably would start by saying that it should be more about quality than quantity. Speaking personally, my bill is already 6 pages long, and I can tell you, I'm not more informed as a result. In fact, I'm much more confused. And so I think it should be more, and all of us need to find better ways of presenting the information in a simpler way. Maybe more visually, we all respond now to icons and graphs and things of this sort of nature. Also for many groups of consumers, not everybody, apps and websites and emails are also giving information and helping to clarify things. I also find one thing that my supplier does do, which I quite like, is when they send me the bill, not every single month, but most months, I have a little information brochure. It's about the social tariffs, or it's about the renewables, or it's about something. So they include in the bill an extra piece of information in a separate format, so I can take it or leave it and digest it as I will. So I think it's more about finding ways to communicate rather than more bills and more pages. And I think that is a challenge. There's no obvious and one-size-fits-all answer, but certainly I think we have a lot of rules and requirements already from the EU legislation and the clean energy package, which Adela was mentioning. And it can be, if you try to include all of it sequentially, it can be quite overwhelming for your average person, or even someone who supposedly knows the sector. So I think that's important to really try to be creative a little bit more and simplify things and reduce the amount of legal language that many of us feel, or many of our companies feel they have to use to cover themselves.
Yeah, thank you very much, Natalie. So the next question is directly addressed to Philip. What he thinks that the fact that there are fewer contracts from fewer suppliers, how that impacts negatively the demand side, demand response potential to ease the grid management. If I may pass to Philip.
Just to, again, keep it really short, but say that essentially, yes, it's a big concern that customers now generally they're more opposed to how to say time of use tariffs than they were before the crisis. We got an issue here, which is now that customers want more predictability, suppliers want less predictability in what they're offering to their customers. So suppliers don't want to offer fixed, and customers don't want anything else. But so there's a problem. I think that the issue is that in one way, I think this will damage the popularity of tariffs that enable demand response. On the other hand, I think for some people, for example, if you're an EV owner, there will be massive benefits from having, if you're able to have a separate contract for just EV, or if that's a big part of your consumption, to actually if you've got very controllable load, then I think that will be a big way of saving money going forward. So I think yes and no, there are good and bad on that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Philip, for answering Alice's question. The next one is you mentioned an increase in prices linked to the spot prices. Do you have an analysis on how that relates to changes in liquidity for in forward markets from Rita, Alexandra?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
I would just, is that for me or? Sorry.
Yes.
Sorry. I would just say, yes, it does have an impact, in my opinion. I believe that what happens is that the liquidity has been so bad that actually we're seeing less reliance or less hedging than arguably than there was before, or less ability to hedge than there was before. That naturally means that you have more exposure to essentially to the spot. So I believe that ultimately that is yet another reason why there's an extremely important necessity to be spot related.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Philip, for your prompt reaction to that one question. I was a bit scared having no question at the beginning. Now we have more than question we can tackle currently now. So I would like to assure you that we are going to respond to you to the following questions per email, because giving the timing, actually I'm behind the schedule, and I would very much like to turn to Chila Bartok. And Chila, if you would be so kind and would conclude our webinar with the closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Jana, and good afternoon to all of you. I would like also to appreciate the audience for the great questions, and certainly the contributors, the speakers, and the organizers of this webinar. I really like, and I'm grateful that that the audience took a little bit further the report conclusions, recommendations, and you were asking questions about energy poverty or supplier bankruptcy. And it's also very interesting that most of us are wondering about the evolutions of the prices and how wholesale and retail price relationship work out in our hands. We will definitely reflect on these questions further down after the webinar, and we will return to you. I'm very, very grateful looking back at the presentation of Philip Lewis and Adela Tesarova. I think these questions that they were raising are particularly crucial and important. I find important of the presentation of Philip in terms of retail price impacts, which are very important in the last year. We'll definitely closely follow the evolution of the prices. We will keep discussing efficiency of the policy measures within ACER and CER, and we will do the utmost to protect the consumers in a meaningful way, while we are taking care also of the trade-offs between protection and energy security. Particularly Adela's thoughts about the implementation of the clean energy package, we find that very, very important. I think we need to progress in a positive manner in terms of implementing the package, and also to ensure consumer empowerment where we are at the crossroads. We will remain as ACER and CER in an open dialogue with both consumers and policymakers to assist them in responding optimally to the current policy challenges. At the end of this webinar, let me emphasize three key messages. The first one, the increase of prices eventually raises important questions around energy poverty. The high prices may stay with us for the rest of 2022 and into 23. So therefore, the protection of the vulnerable users will remain paramount in this period. These consumers shall be able to manage their budgets and be capable to respond and be capable to get access to energy. Beyond offering targeted support to this consumer group, regulators and energy suppliers, but also key energy stakeholders should aim to help them to find efficient solutions for energy use. My second message is about domestic and industrial users. Both domestic and industrial users need assistance because they are also suffering of the high energy prices. This assistance shall not impact nor hinder demand reduction targets, which remains important as we go ahead to the winter. Price signals should be allowed to guide these consumers, but also it is very important to have an open dialogue between policymakers and these stakeholders, including consumer and industrial organizations, to support each other in this difficult time and to understand the needs that the groups have and the policymakers could offer. It is also important that we don't forget that we have some tools in our current legislation and we could make better use of those. Finally, and the third point is about the demand side response and efficiency. Next to the demand reduction that we would very much welcome, we see great opportunity to push forward for additional funding for demand side response and energy efficiency. And we should try to implement these measures with the highest speed possible. Definitely, this crisis calls for better efficiency and better solutions for energy use. And the regulators will be there to support and guide towards those solutions. With these three key conclusions, I would like to close my part. I would like to give back the floor to Jana to help us and assist us to close the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chila, for your conclusions. Ladies and gentlemen, let me please close today's webinar on the key findings, conclusions, and recommendations of the ACER-CEER Market Monitoring Report, Retail and Consumer Prediction Volume. The slides and the recordings will be available on ACER and CEER websites, of course. I would very much like to thank to the speakers and also to you, to our participants, also for being active in our discussion. And we will come back to you in responding those questions hereafter in written form. Wishing you all a nice day and stay safe and take care. Thank you so much.